If you look at the damage is actually quite astonishing. Israel just systematically blasted everything in sight and reduced it to rubble. Whereas on the Israeli side, they say that several houses were damaged and one was almost completely destroyed.
Moves which were going on at the time to take over the occupied territories. So sure, if we'll kill enough of them so that they'll press for quiet to permit us to continue what we're doing. Actually, Obama today didn't put it in those words.
To use culture really as a weapon to distract attention from the occupation and from the allegations of war crimes in Gaza, but even before the Gaza attack. What's interesting is that Toronto has been selected to test market something that is called Brand Israel, the rebranding of it during the attack, which seemed then there was in the aftermath, which just blindsided me. I mean, how could you say that? How could you say that there was more hope while bombs and missiles were falling when those children were being killed than there is now?
ちょうど1年前、昨年の12月末から年始にかけて3週間行われたイスラエル軍によるパレスチナのガザ地区攻撃。皆さんの記憶にもまだ新しいのではないでしょうか。3週間の攻撃で1400人ものパレスチナ人が死亡、そのうち900人以上は民間人だったとの報告もあり、多くの女性や子どもが犠牲になりました。これに対し今年国連は南アフリカの著名な法律家リチャード・ゴールストーン判事が率いる事実調査団を派遣。ゴールドストーン調査団は証拠を詳細に検討した結果、イスラエル軍もハマス側も戦争の最低限のルールを定めるジュネーブ条約に著しく違反したと認定しました。パレスチナの人々が経験したイスラエル軍による残酷な脅威の実態とは一体どのようなものだったのでしょうか。
A United Nations fact-finding mission has found Israel, quote, punished and terrorized civilians in its 3-week assault on Gaza earlier this year, and cited strong evidence that Israeli forces committed grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. More than 1,400 Palestinians, about a third of them women and children, were killed in the assault. 13 Israelis died. The 575-page report came at the end of a 6-month inquiry and was based on dozens of interviews and investigations. The inquiry was led by Judge Richard Goldstone, the former chief prosecutor of the International Courts for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Judge Goldstone said Israel deliberately attacked civilians and failed to take precautions to minimize loss of civilian life.
We came to the conclusion on the basis of the facts we found that there was strong evidence to establish that numerous serious violations of international law, both humanitarian law and human rights law, were committed by Israel during the military operations in Gaza. The mission concluded that actions amounting to war crimes, and possibly in some respects crimes against humanity, were committed by the Israel Defense Force.
Judge Goldstone also said there was evidence that Palestinian armed groups committed war crimes by firing rockets into southern Israel.
Turning to the Palestinian armed groups, there's no question that the firing of rockets and mortars was deliberate and calculated to cause loss of life and injury to civilians and damage to civilian structures. The mission found that these actions also amount to serious war crimes and also possibly crimes against humanity.
Judge Goldstone's report will be presented to the UN Human Rights Council later this month. The investigators recommended the UN Security Council should call on Israel and the Palestinian authorities to launch their own investigations into the conflict within 3 months. If either side failed to do that, the Council should refer the matter to the International Criminal Court prosecutor in The Hague within 6 months. Israel, which had refused to cooperate with the investigation, claimed Goldstone's investigation was biased against Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held consultations with top government officials last night. A senior Israeli staffer told Haaretz newspaper, quote, "The goal is to avoid a slippery slope which would lead Israel to the International Criminal Court in The Hague." Well, Norman Finkelstein joins us here in our Firehouse studio, the author of a number of books, including The Holocaust Industry, Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, and Beyond Chutzpah. His forthcoming book about Israel's assault on Gaza is due out at the end of the year, on the first anniversary of the attack. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Now, this report has just really come out hours ago. Perhaps you're among the few people outside those who have written the report who have actually read the majority of its contents. Talk about the significance of this.
Well, the report is the last in a large number of reports that have been issued on the Gaza massacre. There were 2 significant reports issued by Amnesty International, 5 reports issued by Human Rights Watch, and a whole slew of Israeli-based human rights organizations have issued reports. But this was the most awaited report of all of them. It was commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council, and Richard Goldstone, as you mentioned in your own introductory remarks, is a significant international figure, legal figure. The report basically is consistent with the findings of the other human rights organizations that Israel targeted civilians. Israel targeted civilians who were carrying white flags. Israel systematically targeted the Palestinian infrastructure. The findings were consistent with those of the other human rights organizations. Israel is guilty of a very significant number of war crimes. And also the findings which were other reports, the same conclusions, that the Palestinians were not using hospitals to hide Hamas officials. There's no evidence that the ambulances Israel targeted were carrying Hamas militants or ammunition. And most significantly, in terms of the coverage during the Gaza massacre, the report found, as did Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, there's no evidence whatsoever, and I would want to underline that, there's no evidence whatsoever that Hamas was guilty of human shielding. But on the other hand, there is significant evidence, actually copious evidence, that Israel was guilty of human shielding.
But on other issues of Palestinian militants committing crimes against humanity?
The report found that the Palestinians were guilty of war crimes because of its indiscriminate and intentional firing on civilians in Israel. I'm not trying to make any apologies, but I want to get the facts right. The Goldstone report, like the Amnesty report and the others, you have to look carefully at the proportions. About 9/10, literally about 9/10 of the Goldstone report, like the Dugard report, like the Amnesty report, about 9/10 was devoted to Israeli war crimes, about 1/10 was devoted to Palestinian war crimes. And you have to understand why, because you have to look at the comparable damage. The ratio of killings was about 100 to 1, about exactly 13 on the Israeli side, about 1,400 on the Palestinian side. If you look at the damage is actually quite astonishing. Israel just systematically blasted everything in sight and reduced it to rubble. Whereas on the Israeli side, they say that several houses were damaged and one was almost completely destroyed. So if you look at the facts on the ground, the proportions in the reports, including the Goldstone report, are correct. It's about 10 to 1.